Hi everyone. So I'm Afonso Gonçalves, and I'll be presenting my and my colleagues' work on automating senior fitness testing through gesture detection with depth sensors. I'll start by presenting you some motivation, talking about about fitness assessment, some related work, then the method that we use to automate it, and then how we run the experiment, the data that we got from it, and the results. So as you probably know, it's expected that 1/3 of the European citizens will be over 65 by 2060. Additionally, sedentarism is considered the fourth leading cause of death worldwide and is associated with the incidence of cancer and stroke. So these problems of aging and sedentarism are putting a high strain in our modern societies. New technologies in exergaming show potential to mitigate some of the effects of these facts by either changing the behaviors of the elderly at home, by preventing isolation, and also to provide ways of monitoring the exercises that they can do at home. But if we want to produce good exercise games or exergames, we need to first be able to evaluate or assess the fitness levels of the users. We chose to focus on 3 domains of fitness: lower body strength, agility, and aerobic endurance. This is not only because these are important domains of fitness, but also because they are the ones that show more potential to being automatically tracked by depth sensors. There is a lot of work done on physical assessment and exercise tracking. Some examples here are the use of wearable sensors, either to track exercises, the use of the Nintendo balance board to evaluate standing balance, and with the Kinect, lots of work has been done on gait evaluation, monitoring diseases, but not much on fitness assessment for the elderly. So, what is senior fitness testing? It's a standard practice done to assess the fitness of elderly people. It's a battery of tests which a sports or a health professional can perform on an elderly person to assess his fitness. The first test that we wanted to automate was the 30-second chair stand test, which the purpose is to assess the lower body strength. The person is asked to cross his arms across the chest, and during 30 seconds, the number of repetitions that the person can do by standing and sitting is the score. This score is then compared with normative data from gender and age, and his fitness is assessed on this domain. Another test that we focused is the 8-foot up and go, which the purpose is to assess agility and dynamic balance. The scoring is the time that a person takes to get up from the chair after a starting signal is given, walk 8 feet, and then sit back on the chair. The person does this test 2 times, only the fastest is the score. The last test that we wanted to automate was the 2-minute step test, which is an aerobic endurance test, in which the person is asked to do stationary steps for 2 minutes, the maximum number that he or she can do. The criteria is that the knee must be raised at least higher than the middle point between the knee and the hip. So there's a horizontal plane dividing the hips and the knees. The knee must be raised higher than that. Although these tests are quite simple, they have some limitations. So the supervisor has a subjective evaluation of the movements, if the person is performing each single movement correctly or not. Additionally, it's the workload that the supervisor has. It has to ensure safety of the elderly person doing the test. Might be a frail person, might be about to fall, so this is very important. Also, it has to evaluate every single movement, if it's a correct stand, a correct sit, or a correct stand or sit. And all this while counting the number of repetitions, which can be more difficult than what we imagine, especially on the stepping test, which some people can step maybe 3 times per second. So these tests, because they are mainly based on movement, they show very great potential to be tracked with depth sensors, such as the Kinect 2, which was what we used for this work. Especially the capability of the Kinect to track up to 6 people in a range up to 4.5 meters of 25 joints for each person. Additionally, this device comes with a developer's kit, software developer's kit, with tools to record and replay data, and also to build gesture detectors. Okay, now going into the software of the gesture detectors itself, it's a software that enables us to tag and train detectors, body-based detectors, and it generates these detectors that then can be used in our applications real time. It supports 2 types of supervised learning. The AdaBoost, which gives us a tag of true or false, so it's a discrete detector. It either detects if a gesture is being, or a pose if it's being performed or not. And the random forest regression, which provides us with a value of a regression of what the detector thinks the progress of the gesture is. So on this example, what we have is it's actually me stepping, and you see on the bottom the regression value for what the system thinks for each frame, what was the progress of my knee going up and down. So with this software, we first recorded data from 4 young adults, which were asked to perform the 3 movements, so stepping with the left leg, the right leg, and sitting and standing, and the 2 poses, crossing the arms across the chest, and sitting according to the instructions of what is sitting for the SFT, which is standing with the back straight against the back of the chair, is a specific pose. These were recorded in laboratory conditions. Okay, so for the 30-second chair stand test, we have here on the top left the cross arms detector, just an example of being triggered, which was trained with 12 videos. You can see the details here. And a stand to sit progress detector. For the 8-foot up and go test, we only use the sitting detector, discrete detector, which now is not being activated because the person on the example is not doing the correct sitting pose, but that's okay, now it's triggering. This was used, this gesture detector, to activate the timing of the test, so that we can know when the person gets up from the chair and sits back. For the 2-minute step test, we got 2 detectors, 1 for each leg, of the progress from raising the foot from the ground to the correct height. Okay, sorry, the videos are out of sync now. But so when a person is either stepping in place or just sitting and standing from a chair, what we can see is this type of shapes on the progress detectors. And what we want to do in the end is just to count the number of repetitions that were correctly done by the person. So we can have this simplified example for this presentation, in which what we wanted to do was to count the number of peaks, and we did this by establishing 2 amplitude thresholds. So when the progress goes from below the bottom threshold to above the top threshold, you would count a repetition, a valid repetition. For the 2-minute step test, the thresholds were obtained visually from inspecting the training data. That is, by looking at the training data and the regression values that were the outputs of our models, when the knee, for example, the knee was right about the correct height, the middle point between the hip and the knee, we saw the values, and that's where we set the highest threshold. For the bottom, the lower threshold, these were set also by analyzing the training data, seeing what were the values of the regression when the feet were on the ground. For the 30-second chair stand test, the same was done, but additionally, we wanted to check the influence of these thresholds on our results. So we also, after the experiment that we did, which I will explain later, we asked the sports professional to evaluate the experimental data, and we got the regression values from their experimental data. So opposed as establishing the thresholds a priori from the training data. For the 8-foot up and go test, like I said before, is a time test. What we did was to have a chronometer which was triggered by the sitting position. So a person was sitting, once it got up, the time, this was detected, this time started. Once the person sat again, the chronometer stopped. This while tracking the position of the person to ensure that it did the correct path. So with this method, we had 22 volunteers, elderly volunteers, ages over 60, under 85, which were at least be able to walk independently and had no contraindications for exercising. We had the participants perform the SFT tests in absolute normal conditions. The only difference was that we had the Kinect in front of them recording the performance. And thus we got three sources of data, or data from three sources. First, the assessment done by the health professional, or actually sports professional, on the location, the traditional method, the scoring for each test. Then we asked the professional to do the same assessment, but while looking at the recordings offline. He could go in slow motion, frame by frame, and evaluate every motion. And also the assessment that our system provided. Additionally, we wanted to check for detection rates. So we also asked the professional to tag each gesture on the recordings for positives and negatives. So that is when the person actually performed the movement correctly, like raising the knee to the appropriate height, or negatives when the person did not raise the knee enough. Our system also provides this type of tagging, and thus we could compare both of them to get the detection rates for true positives, so correct true positive detections, true negatives, correct negative detections, and false positives and negatives, so incorrect detections of positives and negatives. Going now into the results for the first test. Like I said before, we had two sets of thresholds. First, the thresholds established a priori. We see here that we have very high detection rates, true detection rates, and quite low false detection rates. Always above 95% of the gestures were correctly recognized. When we adjusted the thresholds, kind of almost cheating we adjusted the thresholds with the same data that we were testing on, we see much higher, obviously, percentages of successes and errors. I will explain in the conclusions what we were hoping to do with this. Now, for the actual scoring of the system, not the performance of the detections, what we found is that for every participant, for the data that we got no significant difference for any method. So they all pretty much measured the same, roughly the same values. For the 2-minute step test, again, we have here the percentages of detections. Again, very high detection rates of over 95%, under 2% for false detections. And for the scoring, so the number of steps actually measured, again, we had no difference between any of our methods that we use, either from our system, the recordings, or the traditional method. Finally, for the 8-foot up and go test, we don't have, obviously, rates of detection, because this test is different. It's not about the number of repetitions, it's about timing. Since we had 22 people performing the test, and each person had to perform the test twice, we actually had 44 time trials. Here's what's being shown is the descriptive statistics for this test. But for the scoring itself, what's important is what's the fastest time that was measured from the two. So we also did that comparison. And what we found from from both of these analyses was that there was a significant difference between the measuring methods. However, the system presented a very high interclass correlation for the consistent definition, not for the absolute value, but for the consistent definition. So the system was very precise but inaccurate. This was due to the fact that our system measured the time from standing up to sitting down, while the professional was measuring the time from giving the start signal to sitting down. So we missed here the time of a reaction of the person. So it was a bias or a bias error that we had of something like 0.7 of a second that we consistently missed. So to finalize some conclusions about this, what we presented is a system that will help the sports professional to measure the scoring of these senior fitness tests. Two of them were accurate, while the last one was not accurate but precise, and we can solve this in the future quite easily, either by asking the professional to either start the chronometer directly on the computer or by making the test actually run by the computer, so that the computer will trigger the start signal. The system had very high rates of detection, of correct detection. This is close to what was found in the state of the art. And so coming back to the sensitivity to the threshold, so that what we did of establishing two thresholds, one a priori based on training data and the other based on the experimental data, by looking at how the performance increased from 95% to around 99%, we can propose that in the future we'll have a calibration phase on our system. So instead of having just the threshold set standard a priori from training data, we will ask the person who's being tested to just once raise the knee to the correct height under the supervision of the person running the test, and the threshold will be established based on this. As a future work, we want to guide the tests, not just measure the performance or measure the score. And we will do this using projection mapping. Particularly now we are aiming at floor projection. In the more distant future, we'll use what we learned from this work to integrate the fitness assessment into the games themselves. So while a person is playing an exer game, he will be tracked for his performance, and fitness will be assessed in this way. And that's all that I wanted to show you. Thank you for your attention.